A side note, when making functions that take an array, do you always need to add the size on the function signature? It depends. Well, first off, functions don't accept arrays. You can't pass an array. You have to pass a pointer. The syntax is confusing, but int a, int size a. These two are exactly equivalent. This is actually a pointer to a, or a pointer. A is a pointer to int, to an int, or to an array of ints. Even though the syntax doesn't make it look like it. It's just backwards compatibility. The syntax is required to be supported, but really it's the same as pointer, and I think you should prefer to write it like this. As far as giving the size, it depends on the kind of array. Usually it's a good idea. If you're passing a vector, then you don't need to give the size. So there's alternatives, like you can pass a pointer to the end. So you got like the begin and end. That's basically the same as giving the size, but it's just a different. Sometimes it's easier to work with begin and end pointers. Another way of doing it is like for C strings, they're null terminated, so you can get their size by enumerating the entire array and finding the zero. That can get bug prone, of course, but I mean anything in C is bug prone, so. So yeah, an alternative to passing a size or the end is by the data having a sentinel value that indicates the end. But that's less common. I would say try to do one of these two. Even if you do have a sentinel value that you could use, like a -1, like in your case, you can do -1 or something for your identifiers. I wouldn't do that. I would have an explicit size. Because it could be -1 for it could be -1 on accident or something. And if it's -1 on accident, you want to be told about it by a GL call failing. You don't want to be told about it by some of your stuff stopped rendering because your loop stopped iterating because it saw the -1, you know? So end would be and A2. No, A would be A and 3. So and wouldn't refer. So well, depends on the convention. It could point to the last thing. The C++ convention for C++ containers, that end points to just after the end. So if you wanted to print all your ints, numbers, like you here in this style, we go for size 0 I less than size a, printf ints I. Or another way you could write it while, well, let's not write a different way. The way you would do that with pointers is you could do current is begin, current is not end, plus plus current, and then do reference current. So this means that this is like the less than comparison. So the size is the index of the last thing plus 1. And so if you have an array of 3 things, then the index to the last thing is 2. 2 is the index. And then you add 1 to get the size. Does that make sense? That's like a way of thinking about it. And a way of thinking about this is the same thing, where you get the last element and then you increment the pointer to go to the next thing to get to the end, or one past the last. And that means that these are basically the same, these comparisons. You never done a GUI and visual before. Oh, okay. Don't start with all this crap. Please don't start with this crap. This is complicated. You're gonna run out of steam and make tons of mistakes if you get into GUI programming with this stuff. Well, get into GUI programming with something this complicated. If you make just this widget, that's kind of tractable for a beginner project, but GUI stuff is complicated. Have I just read about instruction sets, or do you recommend some books? One of my inspirational resources is GBA Tech. This is talking about the Nintendo DS and Game Boy Advance consoles, and they have a section on ARM stuff. Now, it's not like a tutorial or anything, it's a reference manual, but I learned enough from the reference manual to get a decent understanding of assembly instruction sets and stuff. If you want to get a deeper understanding, then write an emulator. I think an emulator is a good project to get a good understanding of this stuff. Why is my browser hanging? PB copy. PB copy. When we're even taught, it's good practice to give an array and a size as parameters, but that's just plain old C. C++ is easier to vector instead, or any of the built-in STL. But if you want to pass a vector to a function, then you're limiting it to a vector, which I guess is fine, but I think it's better to not pass around references to vectors and instead pass around arrays. But I mean, that's debatable. C++ 20 is getting something called, I think they call it span now. C++ 20 has span, which is just a struct containing the begin and the size, but it's packaged as one thing, and it communicates clearly that the size is, like, because it's one object, it would be one parameter, so you can't screw up like mixing them up. And it behaves kind of like a vector in that it has a size method, and you can loop over it with range base 4. Like, okay, so another implementation of this using begin and end would be using span. So if we had std span, thingy span of begin end. So you can construct a span with 2 pointers, I think. I never use span because it's pretty new. So you can construct it with 2 pointers, first and a last, or you can construct it with a first and a size. But span, because it has a begin and end functions which return iterators, you can do range base 4 like this. Maybe it's best to do int. And you could do that. So that's a lot less error prone than something like this. Well, not a lot less error prone, but you know. And you can do the same here where we have ints and size A. So yeah, just throwing that out there. So end would be and A3. Doesn't that give a warning to the compiler? No, it doesn't. So it's valid to get a pointer to one past the end of an array. It's always valid in C and in C++. You can't dereference that pointer because it doesn't point to an object. But you can create that pointer. Chip 8 or 6502, SIGI 64 or NES or the Intel 8080 is a better first emulator than GB8. I agree. I wasn't suggesting making a Game Boy Advance emulator. I'm saying I learned assembly through learning Game Boy Advance. Or rather, through learning Game Boy Advance and primarily this document is how I learned assembly stuff. To get a good knowledge of it, I recommend making an emulator. My first emulator was a Game Gear emulator, Sega Game Gear, which was a Z80 processor. So yeah, 8-bit processors are a lot easier to make emulators with. And the simpler systems like Chip 8 or the C64 are fun. You believe the POSIX way is to pass the size of the array along with the array. You could be wrong. Haven't done C++ in a good while. The POSIX way. There's not many POSIX APIs that take arrays. There's QSort, which takes a pointer, the size of the array in number of objects, and the size of each object. There's fread and fwrite. They take a similar thing. They take a pointer to your thing and a size of each object and the number of things in that object. Well, this is standard C. What else would take a size and a pointer? Like all the string functions are kind of different. I guess like things like snprintf takes in the output string and the size of that buffer in chars. But most POSIX stuff I think doesn't really deal with arrays, except from the I/O, like read, write, send, receive kind of stuff. There's like get adder info. Well, that returns pointer garbage. Get host by name. Okay, get host by name takes. So a lot of the stock, wait, what? Isn't the length part of the address, or is that just certain OSs? You might be right. I don't think POSIX has any cases where they take a begin pointer and an end pointer. If they're going to pass an array with a size, they include the size as a parameter. You're not a huge fan of the way C++ models are iterated. Why not? Why is creating a pointer to two elements past the end of an array? Undefined behavior. Yes. You cannot increment a pointer that is one past the end of the array. Or one past the last element. So you can take a pointer to the last element, you can increment that pointer, but you can't increment it again. If I'm counting sn printf, would I count memcopy memset? Yeah. And those do take the size. But if memset took 2 pointers, then people would stop swapping these arguments, because then I often see like somebody put the size here and then the 0 or whatever they're clearing out there. I mean, not often, but I have seen cases where the right 2 arguments are swapped, and I